The origins of the American presidency. Imagine an America without a president. In 1789, the very idea of an executive leader was so controversial that even the Founding Fathers questioned whether it could work. Yet out of that uncertainty came one of the most powerful offices in the world. It all began with a man who never wanted the job, George Washington. The idea of a president. After breaking away from Britain, the United States faced a daunting question. What kind of leader could unify a fragile collection of states that distrusted centralized power? The framers of the Constitution sought a delicate balance, an executive strong enough to maintain order, but not so strong that it resembled the monarchy they had just overthrown. They drew from Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu, the British constitutional monarchy, and their own colonial experiences to shape the role. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the debates were fierce. Some delegates pushed for a multi-person executive. Others feared that weak leadership would doom the nation. Extreme suggestions, including a president for life, were quickly dismissed. The solution? A single president, chosen not by direct popular vote, but through an electoral college, a compromise between the fear of mob rule and unchecked elitism. Still, many of the president's powers were left intentionally vague. The Constitution granted the executive the ability to appoint officials, command the military, negotiate treaties, and veto legislation, but much was left to interpretation. The presidency, by design, would evolve with the individual holding the office. Even the title, Mr. President, was deliberately modest, signaling a break from royal tradition and a commitment to Republican ideals. George Washington, defining the presidency. When George Washington became the first president, the role was little more than a blueprint. Every decision he made set a precedent. Washington approached power with restraint, refusing lofty titles and embracing humility. He understood that his actions would shape the presidency for generations to come. One of his most lasting contributions was his decision to step down after 2 terms. By declining to run for a third, he established the principle that American leadership should be temporary, not dynastic. This peaceful transfer of power was revolutionary, demonstrating that the presidency would be guided by law, not personal ambition. Washington also established the cabinet, appointing key figures like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton to advise him. Despite their frequent clashes, Washington encouraged debate, setting the precedent that presidents should seek diverse counsel before making decisions. In foreign policy, he tested the limits of executive power. In 1793, without congressional approval, he issued the Neutrality Proclamation, declaring that the U.S. would remain impartial in the war between Britain and France. This bold move signaled that the president could take the lead in foreign affairs. When the Whiskey Rebellion erupted in 1794, Washington personally led federal troops to quell the uprising. It was a dramatic demonstration that the federal government had both the authority and the resolve to enforce its laws. Even in his correspondence, Washington showed reverence for the office. He often delayed responses to ensure letters were transcribed carefully, aware that every word he wrote might be scrutinized by future generations. By the time he left office, Washington had done more than lead a new government. He had defined what American leadership looked like, principled, restrained, and rooted in service. The founding generation takes over. After Washington, the presidency passed to men who had helped build the republic, and who often competed fiercely with one another. John Adams, a Federalist, took office amidst growing tension with France. The threat of war and fears of internal dissent led him to sign the Alien and Sedition Acts, laws that sparked outrage for restricting civil liberties. Thomas Jefferson's victory in 1800 marked the rise of political factions and the first peaceful transfer of power between rival parties. His presidency redefined executive authority, most notably through the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the nation's size. Though the Constitution offered no clear approval for such an act, Jefferson seized the opportunity, expanding both the country and the informal scope of presidential power. James Madison's presidency was defined by the War of 1812. As British forces invaded and burned Washington, D.C., the executive role was tested like never before. Madison's resolve helped the nation endure and emerge with a stronger sense of unity. Ames Monroe followed, presiding over what became known as the Era of Good Feelings. In 1823, he introduced the Monroe Doctrine, declaring that the Americas were closed to European colonization. It was a bold assertion of U.S. influence and a lasting statement of foreign policy. Despite their differences, these early presidents shared a commitment to principle over personality. Together, they showed that the presidency could adapt, evolve, and endure. The rise of partisan politics. Though the founders warned against political factions, parties emerged almost immediately. By the 1790s, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans were battling for control of the nation's future. Federalists, like Hamilton and Adams, championed a strong central government and commercial development. Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, favored agrarian values and limited federal power. The election of 1796 pitted these visions against each other, with Adams narrowly defeating Jefferson. But because the runner-up became vice president, the two rivals were forced into an awkward partnership. By 1800, the flaws of this system became clear. Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr tied in the Electoral College, sending the decision to the House of Representatives. After days of deadlock, Jefferson emerged as president, but the chaos led to the 12th Amendment, changing how presidents and vice presidents were elected. Partisan newspapers fueled these battles, attacking candidates with unprecedented ferocity. Jefferson was accused of atheism. Adams was branded a monarchist. The press had become a powerful political weapon, one that would forever shape presidential politics. Yet even amid the vitriol, the peaceful handoff of power in 1800 marked a triumph for democracy. The presidency survived, and the nation moved forward. Andrew Jackson and the power of populism. The election of Andrew Jackson in 1828 ushered in a new era. The age of elite leadership gave way to the rise of the common man. Jackson, born in poverty on the western frontier, rode a wave of populist sentiment to the presidency. Jackson redefined the office with bold and often controversial actions. He used the veto not just for constitutional objections, but to block policies he opposed politically, most famously, the rechartering of the Second Bank of the United States. He saw the bank as a corrupt tool of the elite and dismantled it, redistributing federal funds to state banks. The move was popular with his supporters, but destabilized the economy. Jackson also embraced the spoils system, rewarding loyal supporters with government jobs. While he saw this as democratizing government, it entrenched cronyism and tied federal positions to political loyalty. His showdown with South Carolina during the nullification crisis reinforced federal authority. When the state tried to defy federal tariffs, Jackson prepared for military action, forcing a compromise and preserving the Union. But Jackson's legacy is also marred by his treatment of Native Americans. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced thousands from their ancestral lands, leading to the Trail of Tears, a devastating chapter in U.S. history. Jackson's personal story added to his mythos. A duel left a bullet near his heart, a constant reminder of his fiery, combative nature. He brought that same intensity to the presidency, making confrontation a tool of governance. From Washington's restraint to Jackson's defiance, the early American presidency was shaped by experimentation, ambition, and principle. What began as a fragile idea became a cornerstone of global leadership. Each president added a new layer, some strengthening the office, others testing its limits. But together, they built a legacy of democratic power and enduring institutions. The presidency was no longer just an experiment. It had become the engine of a new kind of nation, the Expansionist presidency. In the mid-19th century, a new phase of the presidency emerged, one driven by a bold, sweeping vision of national growth. Fueled by the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined to span from coast to coast, presidents began using their power to expand the nation's borders. At the center of this era stood James K. Polk, elected in 1844. Though not as well known today, Polk's presidency was one of the most efficient and consequential in American history. Polk entered office with a clear and aggressive agenda to expand U.S. territory, reform the tariff system, and establish an independent treasury. Unlike many presidents before or after him, he accomplished everything he set out to do, all within a single term. His expansionist campaign began with the annexation of Texas, which had recently declared independence from Mexico. The move, though highly controversial, brought Texas officially into the Union in 1845, practically ensuring conflict with Mexico. Simultaneously, Polk settled a long-standing dispute with Britain over the Oregon Territory. Through peaceful negotiation, the border was drawn at the 49th parallel, granting the U.S. control over a vast stretch of the Pacific Northwest, fulfilling a campaign promise and avoiding war. But the defining event of Polk's presidency was the Mexican-American War. After a skirmish along the disputed Texas-Mexico border near the Rio Grande, Polk seized the moment. Without a formal declaration of war from Congress, he moved quickly to mobilize American troops. This move set a powerful precedent. A president acting unilaterally in foreign conflict, expanding executive authority in wartime. The war ended with a sweeping U.S. victory and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Through it, the United States acquired what would become California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and parts of several other states, over 1 million square miles of new land. The map of America was redrawn almost overnight, but with new territory came new tensions. Chief among them, the question of whether slavery would be allowed in these newly acquired lands. These debates between free and slave states sharpened the sectional divides that would later explode in a civil war. Polk's expansionist success had inadvertently laid the groundwork for America's most devastating internal conflict. As new lands brought waves of immigrants, a surge of nativist backlash followed. The expanding borders sparked cultural and political friction that future presidents would be forced to confront. Despite these complications, Polk's legacy remains striking for its clarity and execution. He had set specific goals, met them, and chose not to seek re-election, stepping aside after a single term. In an era often marked by ambition and overreach, Polk's restraint in power contrasts sharply with the broader narrative of presidential aggrandizement. Abraham Lincoln and the war presidency. No presidency has been more defined by crisis or transformation than that of Abraham Lincoln. Taking office in 1861 as the country teetered on the brink of collapse, Lincoln faced the unimaginable, a civil war that would become the bloodiest conflict in American history and a test of the presidency's moral and constitutional limits. The Confederate attack on Fort Sumter marked the beginning of war, and Lincoln responded with swift, decisive action. He called for 75,000 troops without waiting for congressional approval, asserting the power of the executive in wartime with a boldness that reshaped presidential precedent. Lincoln also suspended habeas corpus, allowing the military to arrest and detain individuals without trial. It was a deeply controversial move, one Lincoln defended as necessary to preserve the Union. He argued that to save the Constitution, it was sometimes necessary to stretch it. It was a paradox he navigated with caution and resolve. Yet Lincoln's presidency wasn't just about war strategy. As the conflict deepened, so did the moral stakes. Though he initially insisted that his goal was to save the Union, not to end slavery, Lincoln came to understand that the two were inseparable. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, using an executive order to transform the war into a fight for human freedom. The proclamation didn't immediately free all enslaved people, but it shifted the war's moral foundation and changed the international landscape. By aligning the Union with abolition, Lincoln discouraged European powers like Britain and France from siding with the Confederacy. Lincoln's brilliance extended beyond battlefield decisions and executive orders. Through words, he redefined what it meant to lead. The Gettysburg Address, just 272 words, captured the essence of democracy and sacrifice. His second inaugural address, delivered in the final days of the war, struck a tone of sorrow and forgiveness, offering a vision of reconciliation even amid destruction. Behind closed doors, Lincoln navigated a treacherous political environment. His cabinet was famously filled with rivals, strong personalities like William Seward and Salmon P. Chase, who didn't always agree with him. But Lincoln saw value in disagreement. He kept them close, using patronage and political savvy to hold his fragile coalition together. In 1864, he achieved what many thought impossible: re-election during wartime. The victory underscored the strength of democracy even in the darkest hours of conflict. But just days after Union victory was secured, Lincoln was assassinated, cut down at the very moment he was preparing to heal the nation he had fought to preserve. An ironic footnote to his legacy: on the day of his assassination, Lincoln signed legislation establishing the Secret Service, not yet to protect presidents, but to combat the growing crisis of counterfeit currency. It would be decades before the agency would take on the role of presidential protection, one Lincoln himself would tragically not live to benefit from. Reconstruction and executive power. In 1865, following Abraham Lincoln's assassination, the presidency passed to Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat faced with the towering challenge of reconstructing a nation shattered by war and divided by slavery. Many initially hoped Johnson would carry forward Lincoln's vision of reconciliation and unity. But it quickly became clear that his approach would take a very different path. Johnson's plan emphasized leniency toward the former Confederate states. He offered widespread pardons and allowed Southern leaders to rejoin the Union with minimal requirements. While this appeased some in the South, it enraged the Republican-controlled Congress, which believed his policies abandoned the newly freed African Americans to the mercy of former slaveholders. A defining feature of Johnson's presidency was his open opposition to civil rights. He vetoed landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which aimed to guarantee legal protections for Black Americans. Congress overrode his veto, a rare and powerful rebuke that deepened the rift between the executive and legislative branches. When the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all people born in the U.S., was introduced, Johnson actively campaigned against it. His alignment with former Confederates reinforced growing perceptions that he was obstructing efforts to build a more equal post-war society. The conflict came to a head in 1868, when Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act by attempting to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton without Senate approval. The House of Representatives impeached him, the first impeachment of a U.S. president. During the Senate trial, the very future of presidential authority seemed at stake. Johnson ultimately avoided removal by a single vote, but his credibility was shattered and his influence crippled. When Ulysses S. Grant assumed the presidency in 1869, Reconstruction took a more assertive turn. A former Union general, Grant used federal power to combat racial violence in the South, especially attacks by the Ku Klux Klan. Through the enforcement acts and the deployment of federal troops, he redefined the presidency as an active enforcer of civil rights, a dramatic shift in executive power. Yet, Grant's administration was marred by corruption and scandal, which eroded public trust and undermined Reconstruction's long-term impact. By 1877, the era came to an abrupt end. A political compromise secured Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South. The collapse of federal enforcement paved the way for nearly a century of segregation and disenfranchisement. Reconstruction showed both the potential and limitations of presidential power in shaping the nation's future. One symbolic moment came in 1866, when Johnson toured the country by train during the midterm elections. His aggressive, confrontational speeches, an early version of campaign-style rallies, backfired spectacularly, alienating voters and accelerating his political downfall. The Gilded Age presidents. With the end of Reconstruction, the presidency entered a period of diminished influence. The late 19th century, known as the Gilded Age, was marked by explosive industrial growth, extreme wealth inequality, and widespread political corruption. During this era, the presidency often took a backseat to Congress, corporate interests, and powerful political machines. Presidents like Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, Grover Cleveland, and Benjamin Harrison struggled to assert meaningful leadership. Though they held the highest office in the land, they were often more reactive than proactive, responding to crises rather than shaping the national agenda. One of the era's most corrosive problems was patronage. Government jobs were routinely handed out as political favors under the spoils system, rewarding party loyalty over merit. This practice became so entrenched that even as public outrage grew, reform seemed nearly impossible. The turning point came with the assassination of President James Garfield in 1881. He was shot by a disgruntled office seeker who believed he had been unfairly denied a government post. The tragedy exposed the dangers of patronage and sparked a national reckoning. To the surprise of many, Garfield's successor, Chester A. Arthur, a product of the spoils system himself, emerged as a reformer. In 1883, he signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act into law, establishing that many government jobs should be awarded based on merit rather than political connections. This created the foundation of the modern civil service system. Elections during the Gilded Age were often fiercely contested and decided by razor-thin margins. Regional and class divisions between North and South, industrialists and farmers, dominated politics. Allegations of fraud and manipulation were common, further eroding faith in the presidency. Grover Cleveland, the only president to serve non-consecutive terms, offered a rare example of executive restraint. Elected in 1884, he opposed protective tariffs and championed fiscal conservatism. Though his reforms were modest, they stood out against the backdrop of unchecked industrial power. Some Gilded Age presidents did begin to expand the nation's role on the world stage. Benjamin Harrison, for instance, oversaw naval expansion and laid the groundwork for a more assertive foreign policy. But these efforts were overshadowed by domestic concerns and the overwhelming influence of corporate monopolies and political machines. Still, the era was one of profound change. The rise of industrialization and technological innovation, like the advent of electricity, transformed daily life. Harrison was the first president to install electric lighting in the White House, but he and his wife were so unnerved by the new technology that they refused to touch the light switches, a small but revealing glimpse into the era's uneasy relationship with progress. Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressive Presidency. Theodore Roosevelt didn't just step into the presidency, he charged into it. At 42, he became the youngest president in U.S. history following the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. From the start, Roosevelt broke sharply with the passive style of his Gilded Age predecessors. To him, the presidency was not just a ceremonial role, but a powerful platform for moral leadership and reform. Roosevelt called it the bully pulpit, a stage from which the president could rally public opinion and drive social change. He used this power fearlessly, targeting the unchecked influence of large corporations. Known as the Trust Buster, Roosevelt wielded the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies that threatened fair competition and the public good. One of his most notable victories came with the dissolution of the Northern Securities Company, a massive railroad trust led by J.P. Morgan. Roosevelt believed that when private power grew so immense that it endangered democracy, it was the president's duty to intervene. This marked a radical shift in how Americans viewed the presidency, as an engine of reform rather than merely a steward of the status quo. He didn't stop at economic reform. Public outrage over unsafe food and drug production, sparked by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, led Roosevelt to push for the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. These landmark laws created the foundation for consumer protection in the U.S. and showed Roosevelt's willingness to respond to and amplify the voices of investigative journalists known as muckrakers. On the world stage, Roosevelt's leadership was just as bold. His big stick foreign policy, speak softly and carry a big stick, combined diplomacy with the credible threat of force. It was under this doctrine that he oversaw the construction of the Panama Canal, securing U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, Roosevelt became the first sitting president to leave the country when he traveled to inspect the canal's progress. His international stature grew further when he brokered peace between Russia and Japan, an achievement that earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906, the first ever awarded to an American president. Roosevelt's public persona was energetic, uncompromising, and deeply committed to reform. In 1912, after his presidency, he returned to politics to run for a third term. During a campaign event, he was shot by an assassin, but refused medical care until after he delivered a 90-minute speech with a bullet lodged in his chest. It was a moment that embodied his fierce will and belief in the power of leadership. Theodore Roosevelt didn't merely hold office, he transformed it. By expanding the scope and ambition of the executive branch, he redefined what Americans expected from their presidents, setting the stage for the modern presidency. The quiet presidents, 1920s conservatism. After the sweeping reforms and international leadership of Woodrow Wilson and the turmoil of World War I, Americans longed for peace, stability, and simplicity. The presidents of the 1920s promised just that. But their brand of calm governance came at the expense of federal oversight and executive ambition. Warren G. Harding, elected in 1920, embodied this desire for a quieter, less interventionist presidency. His campaign slogan, "A return to normalcy," struck a reassuring chord with a war-weary public. Harding advocated for limited government, especially in economic matters, favoring laissez-faire policies that gave industries room to grow with minimal regulation. However, the simplicity Harding promised was soon overshadowed by scandal. His administration became notorious for corruption, most infamously the Teapot Dome scandal. In this case, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall secretly leased federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. Fall became the first U.S. cabinet member to be imprisoned, and the scandal severely damaged public trust in Harding's leadership. It exposed how unchecked cronyism could hollow out the presidency's moral authority. Following Harding's sudden death in 1923, Vice President Calvin Coolidge assumed office. Coolidge was the embodiment of restraint, quiet, austere, and deeply conservative. Nicknamed Silent Cal for his terse demeanor and few public remarks, he famously declared, "The business of America is business." Coolidge's policies reflected this philosophy. He believed that prosperity would flourish best under minimal government interference. Under his administration, the economy boomed. Industries like automobiles, consumer appliances, and construction surged during the Roaring '20s. But that prosperity came with a cost. Economic gains were uneven, favoring the wealthy while much of rural America, especially farmers, was left behind. Coolidge resisted calls for government intervention even as economic warning signs appeared. His approach deliberately reduced the public role of the presidency, delegating much of the executive work to his cabinet and avoiding bold initiatives. In 1929, Herbert Hoover succeeded Coolidge, bringing with him a reputation as a brilliant engineer and humanitarian. He had earned global praise for organizing food relief during World War I and was seen as a model of competence and compassion. But just 7 months into his presidency, the stock market crashed, plunging the nation into the Great Depression. Hoover, committed to principles of self-reliance and limited government, hesitated to use federal power aggressively. He encouraged voluntary cooperation among businesses and launched modest public works programs, but refused to adopt the sweeping government intervention many believed was needed. As unemployment soared and breadlines stretched across cities, Hoover's restraint came to symbolize inaction. His presidency, once full of promise, became a cautionary tale about the limits of conservative governance during a national emergency. Together, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover defined an era of subdued executive leadership. They shared a belief in small government, but their presidencies exposed the dangers of too little federal response during times of rapid social and economic upheaval. Ironically, one of the most memorable moments from this otherwise quiet era came in a lighthearted form. Coolidge's use of a mechanical horse for exercise inside the White House. The odd gadget became a symbol of his quirky, restrained approach to power, a strange but fitting metaphor for a presidency defined more by silence than by action. This era of conservative minimalism paved the way for a dramatic shift in presidential power. With the onset of the Great Depression, Americans would soon look to the federal government and the presidency for bold solutions. That moment arrived with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, ushering in a new age of expansive executive leadership. Trump, Biden, and the polarization of power. In recent years, the presidency has transformed from a traditional institution into a stage for disruption, populism, and personal branding. No figure exemplified this shift more than Donald Trump. A New York real estate mogul and reality TV personality with no prior government experience, Trump entered office in 2017 on a wave of anti-establishment sentiment. He cast himself as an outsider who would shake up the system, and he did. At the heart of his administration was the doctrine of America First, a nationalist approach that prioritized U.S. interests over global alliances and institutions. This philosophy drove major decisions, including withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, challenging NATO allies, and renegotiating trade agreements. Trump's leadership style was combative and unapologetically polarizing. He regularly clashed with the media, Democrats, and even members of his own Republican Party. Immigration became one of his most defining issues. Within his first week, he issued a travel ban targeting several Muslim-majority countries, sparking nationwide protests and legal challenges. His administration's policy of separating families at the U.S.-Mexico border drew international condemnation. Domestically, Trump championed massive tax cuts and a sweeping rollback of federal regulations, moves praised by his supporters as pro-business, but criticized for exacerbating economic inequality. His frequent use of executive orders reflected a willingness to sidestep traditional legislative negotiation. More than any president before him, Trump harnessed social media, particularly Twitter, to communicate directly with the public. Through his personal account, he issued policy updates, political attacks, and rallying cries, without filters or intermediaries. This gave him unmatched control over the national conversation, but also deepened political division. His tweets often sparked outrage, spread misinformation, and fueled America's increasingly tribal political landscape. Trump became a uniquely polarizing figure, admired with near-religious devotion by his base and vehemently opposed by his critics. That polarization reached a historic climax during his final year in office. He was impeached twice, first in 2019 for allegedly pressuring Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden, and again in 2021 for inciting the January 6 Capitol riot. Though acquitted by the Senate both times, the second impeachment came in the wake of one of the darkest days in American democracy, an attack on Congress aimed at overturning the 2020 election results. The chaos solidified Trump as the most controversial modern president. Into this deeply fractured political landscape stepped Joe Biden. Elected in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic, Biden campaigned as a stabilizing force, an experienced, empathetic leader who promised to restore civility and rebuild trust in American institutions. His presidency, however, has faced immense challenges. One of his first major tasks was the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Aimed at ending America's longest war, the exit quickly spiraled into a crisis as the Taliban seized control, raising tough questions about foreign policy and American credibility abroad. Globally, Biden has shifted focus toward rising tensions with Russia and China, steering foreign policy toward a new era of strategic competition rather than counterterrorism. At home, Biden has faced a deeply divided Congress, pandemic recovery hurdles, inflation, and intense political polarization. Despite efforts to restore bipartisan cooperation, the fault lines in American politics remain wide. Trump and Biden represent two starkly different visions of presidential power. One prioritized disruption and dominance of the media narrative. The other sought steadiness and restoration. Yet both presidencies have existed within a climate of intense division, each navigating a nation more polarized than at any time in modern memory. Biden's inauguration, held just weeks after the Capitol riot and amid a global pandemic, was the most heavily secured in American history. It served as a sobering reminder. The modern presidency is no longer just a position of leadership. It is a reflection of the country's greatest tensions and vulnerabilities. The American presidency began as an experiment, power without a crown. Over more than 2 centuries, that experiment has evolved into one of the most powerful offices on the planet. Shaped by war, crisis, reform, and revolution, each president, from Washington to Biden, has left an indelible mark on the office and the nation.